Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. We're born alone, we live alone, we die alone, Orson Welles once said. But is it true? Is existence truly a journey of isolation? A silent, personal odyssey that no one can fully understand? There are things we keep hidden, words left unspoken, fears held close. Maybe it's the fear of judgment, the shadow of doubt, or the terrifying idea that no one would understand if they heard or believe you. But here, at the Darkest Hour, we're listening. This is a place where your hidden experiences, the ones that linger in your mind and haunt your dreams, can finally be shared. And tonight, I'd like to take you through a few of these stories, because while life might be a deeply subjective journey, fear is universal. It doesn't discriminate, no matter your age, gender, or class. Fear is the one shadow we all know. So, let's get started, shall we? When I was a sophomore in high school, there was a series of attacks against girls by a temporarily unknown masked assailant. It all started with a girl from our senior class named Lynn. She was attacked in the parking lot during a football game. I hadn't been friends with her, but I was at the game and word spread quickly about what had occurred that night, right outside the gates. An older couple had found Lynn lying on the ground in a row of cars in the parking lot. The woman ran back to alert the police that were at the game while the man stayed with the unconscious Lynn. I didn't leave my seats in the stands, but from where I was, I could see the ambulance flying down the highway from across the football field, heading towards the school. Lynn had been hit in the back of the head with a heavy object. The attacker was wearing a hoodie and a bandana over the bottom of their face. He went at Lynn with a knife, but she either fought him off or caused enough of a scene to make him run away. Either way, she still sustained a few cuts and abrasions on her arms and legs from the struggle. The high school I went to was a relatively big one, but Lynn already had a reputation for being a bit of a drama queen, so rumors started that she had done it to herself for attention. But then, another girl was attacked, Courtney. This time it was after volleyball practice. She was leaving the back exit of the gym when the perpetrator struck. Courtney was also struck in the back of the head and immediately knocked unconscious. When a teammate found her, she'd been stabbed in the shoulder. This prompted a police investigation, and the rumors really started to fly around. Some were accusing other classmates, even some faculty members were brought in to speak with the police, but nobody was revealed to be a person of interest. Meanwhile, Lynn starts receiving messages from her attacker. The letters would be stuffed into her locker. They'd be filled with all sorts of threats of all kinds of abuse. Lynn's address was posted in the letters, along with Polaroid pictures of her house. She gave them to the police, but it still didn't help to narrow down their list of suspects. Then, another girl was attacked, Lauren. This time, it was at another football game. She, like the other girl, was attacked from behind with a blunt object. Her clothes were cut and torn with a knife, and she was punched multiple times. Then the person ran away. It was completely random, but at least a better description was formed. Lauren described them as medium height and even noted that they had long hair as they saw it escape through their hoodie. There were ski goggles and a bandana over the bottom of their face. After that, the whole school was on high alert for a while. Attendance at the games was noticeably lowered, and people started walking in groups wherever they went. Everyone was suspicious of everyone else. Lynn had stopped showing up to school, and it felt like this menace had full control over the staff and students. Kids volunteered to bring Lynn's homework to her, and kids would stop by to check on her. A real support system developed for Lynn because she was the only one of the victims that continued to be contacted by this person. The letters she was receiving were becoming more and more gross and shocking. Then, at the last home game of the season, an off-duty police officer that had been involved in the case sees Lynn's car parked in the south lot of the field. He thinks it's strange considering her absence from school, so he drives back to the north lot where the main gates are. But instead of parking and going into the game, he decides to sit and wait in his car for a while. His daughter at the time is a junior at the school. I think her name was Jessica. She's also at the game that night, and just before the second half of the game, Jessica receives a call on her cell phone. She leaves her seat from the stadium to walk out into the parking lot by herself. Meanwhile, the game is raging inside. Our team was predicted to be state champs that year, so the stands were full and the crowd was rowdy and loud. Jessica didn't care about the game, though. She had other plans in mind when she left for her leisurely stroll that night. Her plan would come to fruition. Jessica had been slowly walking up and down the rows of cars for about 10 minutes when, aside from the crowd noise, she hears gravel getting kicked up from behind her. She realized she wasn't in the parking lot by herself, and whoever else was out there with her was approaching fast from behind. Then, just before the assailant could get close to her, a third voice disrupted their motion. A loud, deep voice screamed, "Freeze!" Jessica turns around to see the hooded figure only a few strides behind her. She can hear the metallic knife bounce off the concrete of the parking lot. That would-be attacker was so startled by the scream, they dropped their knife and started to flee. But Jessica's dad, the off-duty officer, was already sprinting toward the hooded figure. They weren't able to get enough momentum, and Jessica's dad tackles them to the ground with a hit reminiscent of the football game going on inside the stadium. Too good to be true? Perfect timing? No. Jessica and her dad had been doing this ever since the attack started, their own father-daughter sting operation, and that night, the bait was finally bit. As the dad stands over the suspect, they got the wind knocked out of them, and they were writhing on the ground trying to breathe. Then, he pulls the ski goggles off. And to Jessica's surprise, and not so much her father's, they see Lynn lying on the ground, tears in her eyes, trying to get the air back into her lungs. Naturally, this was the news of the year, and would you believe it, no one ever saw Lynn at our school again. But a little bird told me that she did serve some jail time, even if it was just juvie. I've never really had a scary encounter with anything paranormal, but I was friends with the ghosts at my parents' grocery store. We lived in a small town. It's pretty generous to call that tiny building a grocery store, but we loved it. My parents have since upgraded, but I'll always have a special fondness for that building. When I was 14, my parents often had me restock the shelves after closing. My dad always joked about having a ghost, but I never took him seriously. Then one day, I was on a stepladder and accidentally bumped my cart, sending it rolling just out of my reach. I jokingly said, "Hey, if there's a ghost in here, can you push that back over?" The cart had been completely still when I said that, but then it slowly inched back, gently bumping the ladder. I couldn't believe it, like that wasn't really a ghost, right? But I said thanks anyway. When it was time to move the ladder down, I left the cart where it was and asked the ghost to push it again. Just like before, it rolled to me, nice and easy. I did the same thing with the rest of the inventory and talked to the ghost while I worked. I told it my name, who my friends were, stuff that was going on at school. When I was finished restocking, I grabbed a can of raviolis and laid it on the floor. The plan was to ask the ghost questions, have it roll the can forward for yes or backwards for no. Unfortunately, it didn't move that night, but it worked a few weeks later. Maybe she was still getting to know me. She didn't answer many questions in a single night, but this was a 2-year relationship. I eventually learned that she was 12 years old, had died in a car accident right outside our store. The rest of her family survived. It happened sometime in the 70s. I once asked if she liked my family because we reminded her of her own, and she said yes. She also had a brother, so maybe I reminded her of him. I never saw her appear in physical form, but there were a few times I thought I heard her call my name. Then, when my grandmother passed away, I swear I felt her squeeze my shoulder while I was crying. When I eventually had to tell her my parents bought a bigger building, several cans went flying off the shelf. It was the only time I'd ever seen her angry. Hell, I was angry too. I asked if she could come with us, but she said no. Whether she really couldn't or just didn't want to, I'll never know. I tried going to see her in the years before I graduated, but she didn't communicate with me anymore. Once I moved away for college, I tried to put it behind me, but now it's more than 15 years later, and I still think often about her. I hope she made new friends over the years. In the 90s, I waited tables at a popular seafood restaurant. One day, my boss hired a new busboy named, swear to God, Petroni. Everyone called him Roni. Roni was from Chicago and was really a decent guy. He moved to our town because of a girl, and he'd got dumped 6 weeks later. Kind of a cliche story. But he was only 23. He didn't know better yet. He came into the restaurant just wanting to make enough money for a plane ticket home. He was only supposed to be there for a few weeks, tops. Then he met Trinity, a 44-year-old woman with a heavy drug addiction and a history of violence. Somehow they hit it off, and the next thing you know, Roni isn't in such a rush to get home. Suddenly, it's a year later, and they're living in a shotgun house downtown. Roni went from being a pothead to doing all the hard stuff with Trinity. They had to deal on the side just to support their habit, and they were always getting their lights turned off for not paying their bills. For a while, Ronnie's parents would send him money, but when they got suspicious about his drug usage, they cut him off. They still offered to buy him a plane ticket, but he couldn't have any more cash. I bought them dog food all the time just to make sure their puppy wasn't starving too. Trinity had been pretty bad off since she started working at the restaurant. We'd never seen a healthy version of her, but it was incredibly sad to watch Roni waste away, knowing how healthy and vibrant he'd been just a year before. Eventually, the inevitable happened. He got stabbed and told the police that it was a random mugging, but we always wondered if Trinity had stabbed him or if it was over a drug deal. No one was ever arrested, no surprise there. Thankfully, he survived, but he lost his gallbladder. That was the wake-up call he needed to go home. He flew back to Chicago as soon as he was well enough to travel, and we never heard from him again. No social media back then. In 2010, Trinity's body was found in a ditch. Her clothes were removed, and she'd been strangled. She was still working for the restaurant at the time, and a mutual friend told me that the police didn't come down to question any of them. When they asked about the investigation, they were told not to get their hopes up. Trinity was well known and greatly disliked by the police, so they never even put effort into finding her killer. So I, 31-year-old female, have recently started going back to the gym. I love going, but I have a problem exercising in front of other people. The reason that I've been able to return is because my best friend is the new assistant manager. She caught her boss's brother working out after closing and learned it wasn't uncommon for management to enjoy this perk. Basically, all I had to do was call ahead of time to make sure no one else was using it that night. So far, this hadn't been a problem, and I'm starting to understand why. that place is haunted. I didn't notice anything unusual the first 2 times I went, but the 3rd time got a little weird. When I was on the treadmill, the one next to me kept turning on. I cut it off the first time it happened. The 2nd time, it ran for maybe a minute and then turned itself off. Later, I was finishing my workout with the leg press machine, which was next to the treadmills. In the middle of my set, the treadmill closest to me, not the same one, turned on. And it also turned itself off roughly a minute later. The next day, I asked my friend about it. She said a few other people had mentioned it, but none of the staff has seen it happen. All the machines have been working fine. I went back to the gym that weekend, but forgot my phone in the car. I didn't realize it was missing until I was already inside, and I'd planned for a short workout, so I decided to skip the music. While I was on the squat machine, a set of footprints seemed to appear in the middle of the floor and across the room behind me. I jumped off the machine to see who it was, but nobody was there. And there's no exit on that side of the room. Even so, I knew what I heard. I went back to my car and woke my friend up to confirm no one else should be there. When I told her about the footsteps, she pulled up the surveillance on her phone and sent me a screen recording of just myself jumping at nothing. No one was there. No footsteps were heard on the audio, but they had been so clear to me. About a week later, I finally convinced myself I'd been hearing things and went back to the gym. This time, I had the music to cover my unexplained noises, but the treadmills still had a mind of their own. The machine next to me turned on and turned off several times on its own. When I walked past the exercise balls, one rolled into my path. There was no air on, and it didn't just randomly move in front of me on its own. That's a little too much coincidence for me, as if everything else was totally reasonable. Still, a private gym experience doesn't come cheap or easy, so that wasn't enough to make me quit. The last time I went, however, has me reconsidering my social awkwardness. The treadmills did their thing. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, but I really can't be sure. My music was on, and I went in there pretty paranoid. But then I got on the leg press machine, and just a few reps in, something blew into my ear. Like if a friend came up behind you and blew a quick breath into your ear to screw with you. My hair moved. It was unmistakable. I absolutely did not imagine that. I don't know the technical name for the machine with the handlebars that you pull down, but I got off the leg press and just wanted to do a quick set on that thing before leaving. About halfway through, a hand grabbed my shoulder. It was fast, but definitely real. I screamed, like really screamed. Once again, I called my friend. She was thankfully way more patient than I would have been if someone continued to wake me up for no reason. And again, she sent me security footage of myself, freaking the hell out at nothing. No one was there to grab me or blow in my ear, but it sure showed my reaction, and it showed my hair moving. I don't really know what to do. This place is clearly haunted, and each visit seems to get a little worse. Is there any way that a ghost can actually hurt me? Or am I technically safe to keep going? I used to volunteer at a wildlife sanctuary. I guess I probably shouldn't say which one, but we had a variety of animals, including bears. We had just taken in a grizzly that was born and raised in horrible conditions. Basically, he was a giant, angry bear, and rightfully so. I know some sanctuaries can be not as great as they appear, but the one I worked with was extremely professional. Everyone there truly just wanted the best for the animals. None of them could be released into the wild, so we were all they had. New volunteers weren't even allowed near the animals for the first week, and they weren't allowed to work unsupervised for up to 8 weeks pending performance and previous experience. One day, my supervisor called me to the office and introduced me to a young girl that we'll call Carol. She's going to be my new shadow. We got along fine. She was eager and seemed to have the necessary passion for animals. But she was a bit naive, to the point that it worried me. She believed that she had a sixth sense that allowed her to communicate with animals, that they inherently knew to trust her. I told her even if that were true, she absolutely could not test her theory at the sanctuary. We have plenty of animals that the volunteers can interact with, but we never go into the dangerous cages. There's no working your way up to playing with the lions, for example. At most, we clean their cages after the handlers move them. Carol wanted to pet everything. I caught her sticking her hand into the wolf enclosure while we were on break and had to go full boss mode on her. I hated when they made me do that. Anyway, she apologized and we got back to work. Eventually, we passed by the new grizzly's enclosure, and it was still groggy from being tranquilized. It needed a lot of medical procedures to get healthy again, so it was still pretty rough looking. I knew I made a mistake telling Carol its story as soon as I finished saying it. She wanted to run right in there, but the last thing that poor bear needed was her trying to mess with it while it already felt bad. It had a whole team of professionals trying to help it already. I repeated this to her several times. We managed to get through the rest of our shift with no further incidents, and I left feeling a glimmer of hope that she would do better the next day. I was wrong. When I arrived the following morning, I was pulled into the office and informed that Carol had snuck back into the sanctuary late the previous night. She wanted to keep the bear company in its scary new environment. So she climbed into its enclosure and tried to give it a fish. Sadly, she was mauled for her efforts. Not only did she go into the enclosure, she surprised the bear while it was sleeping. She never stood a chance. A few of the grizzly's handlers were sleeping in a crew cabin nearby, and they were able to get her out. She was then airlifted to the hospital, where she passed away shortly after surgery. That was over 10 years ago, but her death will always haunt me. I quit 2 months later. Being there was just too much. Carol's parents were destroyed, but they didn't blame the sanctuary. They said that she did that kind of thing all the time, and it's always been their worst fear that something like this would happen. I feel like that should make it easier to pass off the responsibility, but it doesn't. This kind of thing is never okay. I shouldn't have believed her when she promised to follow the rules. I should have told my supervisor how much she worried me. Maybe I couldn't have stopped her, but maybe I could have. I inherited my grandparents' property when I was in my early 20s. As a young adult, this was probably the most impactful blessing on my life. It financially opened me up to spend my money in other ways and beginning on a shoestring budget. I'll forever appreciate this home. When I was growing up, early childhood, my mom would drive us out here for visits. The house was next to a dock and a small lake, and I would swim for hours in the summer. There was one winter I even got to skate on it when it froze over. That wasn't fun because of all the sticks and things that were sticking out of the ice, and if I tripped, I was going into the water and freezing to death. It's actually just another memory that scared me relating to this house. Basically, I remember us being out here all the time. His home was used as our personal timeshare because at the time, he was an engineer and regularly rented other houses closer to the work site. This trip was during an especially sweltering day. We left our apartment hoping the rural environment would provide more tree cover and relief from the hot city pavement. It was a good idea, but the area's temperature wasn't all that much better. At this house, though, we could leave all the doors and windows wide open to let a breeze in, and of course, the lake. It was one of these afternoons, and I had just gotten out of the lake and was drying off on the back patio. My mom was sitting in a plastic chair next to me and we were talking, but our conversation was interrupted by the sound of all the windows and doors around the house slamming closed. It started in the front of the house. Front door, living room window, boom, boom, side door, bedroom window. We sat frozen as the slamming sound made its way to us, with the kitchen windows, back patio left door, and then finally, boom, back patio right door, the one that we were closest to. We were anticipating it to slam, but it was still unbelievably scary watching a door move on its own. And then boom, it shook the wood beneath us and my mom let out an uncontrollable eep. When the slamming started, I think we were both half-heartedly thinking that my grandpa had gotten home, and as the slamming got closer, I was more and more expecting to see him. Then the door moved on its own, as well as the side dining room window right after. My mom pulled me close to her, and we sat on the deck waiting for the noises to continue. But after the last dining room window was closed, it all settled down. We both watched windows and doors shut without anyone on the other side. An intruder in the home wasn't what my mom and I were looking for when we walked inside. It was just us two out there, and with no other way to sugarcoat it, she explains that she needs to go inside. Everything we needed was still in there. A phone, her car keys. I didn't want to be left alone, so I was right behind her when we went inside. It was like a furnace when we got in there. My mom said, "Hello, hello," but my grandpa wasn't there. The thermostat in the living room, it was on and turned all the way up. I turned it down while my mom went from room to room checking for an intruder. Finding no one and no other reasonable explanation, the phenomenon was blamed on an air pressure thing in the house. Although this sounds like a lot of excitement, it really wasn't. I probably could have even had this be a forgettable memory, especially with the air pressure excuse being assumed as true. But that afternoon, there was one more thing that happened that really scared me. Again, in my childhood, this is the one and only time that I was genuinely struck with fear due to this house. But after all the rooms were checked and the thermostat was turned back down, both of us were back outside on the deck. This time, we decided to leave the doors and windows closed. We were considering ourselves lucky that none of the windows broke when they came down the first time, and we didn't really want to tempt fate again. It was becoming dusk. The sun was setting across the lake, and my mom and I were enjoying the scenery. We're both sitting on the deck, and we feel the whole house shake, like an earthquake that only lasted a second. The lake wasn't disturbed. The trees around weren't shaking. The sound and feeling only came from inside the house. I turned around first. From where I'm standing, I can see into the house from the window, and clear as day, I see a woman standing in the living room. She can see me too, because when we make eye contact, it looked like she began to scream, but I couldn't hear anything. Then, she evaporated into thin air. I turned to ask my mom if she saw the woman, but she hadn't. I told her, I saw someone in the house. She knew from the tone in my voice that I was serious, so instead of asking further questions, she picked up a hand shovel from the little gardening plot next to the deck and ran inside. Again, she went from room to room, this time with a sharp weapon. Nobody was found. After that, we both felt uneasy. My mom, being the adult in the situation, was feeling more spooked than me and decided to take us home that night. After that, there wasn't any more weirdness. We had many visits after decades of them, and now I own the house. I still feel happy and content with my little abode, as I previously mentioned. I live by myself. Well, not all by myself. It was more for my parents' peace of mind than mine, but it would be an injustice for me not to mention Scooter, my cane corso. He's my giant protector against the squirrel and deer that I've encountered while living out here. I got home the other night and found this big boy wandering around the front yard, and at first I thought Scooty found a way to open the door and let himself out. He's big enough, but can't get the concept of turning the handle down. So I was surprised when I drove up to find him lying in the grass. The huge thunderstorm that rolled past here, it was right over top of us by then, and I was focused on getting him inside before it started to get bad. When I parked in the driveway, the property was dark. I knew the power must have been knocked out. I got out of my car. In mid-walk to Scooter, I turned and looked at the house, trying to figure out what door he'd gotten open, and the hair literally stood up on my arms. It wasn't one door that was open. It was all of them. And then I saw that the windows were all open as well. I was panicking. I thought I'd been robbed. I grabbed Scooter and pushed his big butt into the backseat of my car. Then I got in, locked the doors, and called the cops. When they arrived, we stayed in the car as they did a walkthrough of the house. After they made sure the house was clear, they closed all the open windows and doors, and I was able to go back into the house to see if anything was missing. Nothing was. Everything was how I'd left it in the morning. After the police left, I light a bunch of candles and put them around the house. In an aisle that separates my kitchen and living room, I slip on a wet spot. I almost dropped the candle. I flipped on my phone light to see what I had slipped on, but I couldn't find the source of where any moisture could be coming from. Looking at where I'd fallen, though, I noticed there was actually a small trail of water. The splotches looked like small feet prints, and wow, saying that feels as crazy as it felt in that moment, following the trail of watery prints to the back door. The feet were pointing away from the back door, though, like the prints were entering the house. I just stared at them, baffled as to who was running through my house barefoot. Sure, they weren't there anymore, but I felt sick thinking someone had been through there. Nothing was taken, though. Maybe it's something I haven't noticed yet. And Jesus, I went down a rabbit hole, paranoid, thinking about that one. I went from room to room, checking desks, closets, shoeboxes, everything. All using my cell phone light and Scooter stuck to my hip. All of my jewelry and shoes were untouched. Even cash that I'd left out was still there. Now, I don't want to believe my house somehow got haunted. I don't know how that would even happen. But here I am writing this, only trying to still explain coming home to every door and window being wide open. My dog in the yard, wet footprints in my house. And I still haven't gotten to the part where you think, oh yeah, I guess this place is haunted now for some fucking reason. The power eventually comes on, and when it does, the generators kick in. It's a low vroom startup that shakes the foundations of this old place like a jet engine. New pipes and plumbing, old foundation. Startling at first, but I put two and two together when the rumble sound is in sync with the lights. When the house is lit again, it becomes difficult to see outside in the dark, but almost as if it was right against the glass of the window facing the yard. I realize that I'm looking at the silhouette of a child, a pure black figure outlined in the window in front of me. I took a step toward the window, and they vanished. I tried to tell myself I was just seeing things. Maybe it was the rain or a shadow that was cast by the trees that were swaying. But the chill down my spine told me that something was weird about that. I closed the blinds. I was trying to shake the feeling of eyes watching me. Scooter wouldn't stop pacing. He usually settles in right next to me, but he kept going to the back door, sniffing at it, letting out some low growls, his hackles raised. I'd never seen him like that. Later that night, as I was finally drifting off to sleep, something made me bolt upright. It was the unmistakable sound of little footsteps, faint but clear, pattering across the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I remember holding my breath and my heart was pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself, no way, just the rain. But I couldn't ignore the fact that they sounded like little wet footsteps, each followed by a soft splat, like someone was tracking water across the floor. Scooter growled again, this time from his spot on the floor by my bed. Then the footsteps stopped. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn, but it never did. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And just as I started to relax, I could have sworn I heard a knock on the door. 3 soft taps, and then nothing. I didn't move. and neither did Scooter. I decided I was going to get up. I got out of bed, opened the door just a crack, and looked into the hallway. Nothing. The floor was dry, no sign of any footprints, no sound of anyone else in the house. I went back to bed, but I barely slept. The next morning, I went to check the back door, trying to convince myself that maybe the whole night had been some weird, bizarre, vivid nightmare. But there, right on the inside of the back door, was a single, small, wet handprint. It smeared across the wood as if someone had pressed their hand against it, reaching in. I know some of you will think that I'm crazy, but even having all of these things happen, I know that there's nowhere else I'd rather live. So I'm not really sharing for advice so much as just sharing my most bizarre experiences with what I consider to be the paranormal. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough for those deep sleep videos. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Mary H, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, and TF Parham. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.